Hi guys, welcome to today's class. So in the last class, I introduced to you the scientific method, and I said it's an empirical way of acquiring information. And most importantly, this method of science has characterized the development of science since the 18th century. And we began with the first stage in the scientific method, which is the investigation method. And I said that's the best way that scientists use to solve problems. And in this investigative method, this simply entails the use of asking one or more questions. And the purpose of doing so is to obtain as much information as you will need as regards the problem. Now, the next stage, having collected all this information, is the data collection stage. Now, in this data collection stage, this is where you obtain information, you obtain data from the affected victims of the problem. Now, this data you obtain is what will be used to answer the questions which I've raised in the first stage. Now, of all the stages in scientific method, data collection stage is the longest stage, and it has four major aspects. The first aspect is observation. Now, observation describes the act of the scientist observing something unusual or an unexpected or an unexplained event that's affected that affected organisms, or let's say affected a large number of individuals. So during observation, the scientists make use of all its five senses to perceive an event, an happening, and to make conclusion. Now, for example, the scientists could decide to observe the process of death of a victim of a disease. He could decide to examine a specimen under a microscope. All these activities involved, or all these are what is entailed in observation. The next aspect of data collection stage is measuring. From time to time, you will need to measure. For instance, the scientists could take dimension of an object, but also duration of an event. Let's say duration of a pandemic, duration of a disease outbreak. Could take duration of an event. And in the case of, let's say, a pandemic, for instance, the scientists would like to know how many people died during that period, because that will be very important in future research, and also be very important to actually solve the current problem. The scientists might want to know how many people displayed similar symptoms of a disease. All these fall under measuring. So that's why I said initially that biology is a multidisciplinary science. You don't only need the knowledge of biology, you also need the knowledge of mathematics. I mentioned that earlier on in the class. The next stage is sampling. There might be need for you to take sample of organisms. For instance, in the case of a disease, let's say you have a particular illness, and of course, the doctor will need to have good information for him to carry out prognosis. He could ask that you bring forth samples of your urine, samples of your feces, or samples of heart rate, pulse rate sample. You could take your pulse rate to determine so as to get further information on the nature of your current illness. So all these things falls under data collection. And finally is organization of data. You are just collecting data. You should know that this data collected should be presented in a logical manner. Now note, the organization of data comes after you have observed, you have measured, and you have collected samples. And by organization of data into a logical manner, we mean arranging this data or putting this data into tables, into charts, into graphs, or even maps. And this is very important, as you will be able to compare events or even be able to compare data. So the process of science is very meticulous. I said earlier, you are problem solvers and you are not creator of problems. So while trying to solve a problem, you don't need to create further problems. So try to keep it organized, try to keep it logical. That's the goal of science. I'll see you in the next class.